Hello, this is Charles Scoville, your Golden Harvest Great Lakes area agronomist, and welcome back for another edition of the Golden Harvest Agronomy In Action podcast. So today is July the 10th, and it's been an interesting one for sure. Boy, reports up to 17 inches of rain in some isolated places in northern Ohio to a more moderate 1-inch rain here in the mid-Michigan area, and 3 to 4 inches in parts of southeast Michigan. All that followed by some really nice, drier and warmer weather. So wheat harvest has begun, working its way from the south to the north. Second cutting hay is in the barn here at the Scoville farm, and I just can't hardly believe how fast that corn is growing with this plentiful heat and moisture. Soybeans are starting to fill the rows, though, they just seem like they've just taken forever this year to get going. This week on the podcast, let's talk about, first of all, the risk of nitrogen denitrification in saturated warm soils and maybe how lower humidity impacts that drying cycle, especially if you just finish side dressing. And secondly, let's discuss the rainbow of colors you might be seeing in your corn leaves this week, what those colors are telling us about nutrient deficiencies, and what, if anything, we can actually do about it as this crop rapidly approaches that VT or tasseling stage. So, grab your cup of coffee and let's talk agronomy. So let's start with the weather. A lot of you in southeast Michigan and northern Ohio just wrapped up side dressing your corn, and you got the nitrogen down, and then boom, the skies just opened up and the temperatures remained high. Now, what we know is that when you get heavy rains that saturate the soil profile, followed by temperatures in the 80s, we just have to talk about denitrification. So, what's the why and the how behind denitrification? To understand the risk, we have to look at what's happening beneath the soil surface. So, denitrification is a biological process. The soil bacteria operating in anaerobic conditions, meaning there's no oxygen because those soil pores are just completely filled with water, and they start using nitrate nitrogen as an oxygen source. So in doing so, they convert that valuable liquid plant food into nitrogen gases that we can and will have escape right out of your soil and into the atmosphere. Now, this process is highly temperature dependent, so if your soils are saturated but the soil temperature is only 50 degrees, denitrification is incredibly slow, maybe 1 to 2% loss per day. But when soil temperatures climb into the 70s and 80s, those soil microbes, they just go into overdrive. So under warm, saturated conditions, you can easily lose 4 to 5% of your nitrate nitrogen for every single day that those soils remain completely waterlogged. So the good news, if there is any in this situation, is the humidity factor. Kind of a silver lining for drying. When the air is dry and humidity is low, the atmosphere acts like a sponge. Now, even though the soil is saturated right now, that lower humidity encourages rapid evaporation from the soil surface, and it drives high transpiration through the corn leaves. Now, this means that as long as the sun is shining, the crop and the air both are working together to pump water out of the soil profile much faster than they would on maybe a muggy, high humidity day. So the quicker we can get oxygen back into those root zones, the faster we can shut down that denitrification process. So that begs the question, what does this mean for your side dress? Now, if you applied your nitrogen as anhydrous ammonia or even UAN recently, it does take time to convert to the nitrate form. Now, if you used a nitrification inhibitor, or if the nitrogen was a applied just a couple of days before the rain, then a good portion of it may still be in the ammonium form. Now, ammonium binds to the soil and does not denitrify or leach. However, if your nitrogen has been out there for a couple of weeks and has fully converted to nitrate, a prolonged 3 to 4 day saturation event in this heat means you have already lost a portion of that investment. So the take-home action here is don't panic and don't hook up the Y drops just yet. Thanks to the lower humidity, these soils should breathe a bit quicker. So let's let them dry out. Once the roots can breathe again, we'll need to evaluate the crop's color and its growth. If you suspect heavy losses, you can always run a late season soil nitrate test, or we can even use aerial imagery to see if a late rescue application of nitrogen is warranted. Now, if you need me to bring the drone out, or even want to use the satellite imagery available in the GHX mobile app, just give me a call and we can help you out with it. So next, let's talk a little bit about the corn leaf rainbow of colors that I'm getting calls about this week. As you get out and scout your fields over the next week, you might notice some corn plants less deep and dark and green in their color and more like a box of crayons. Now, corn is incredibly expressive. When it's stressed or lacking a nutrient, it tells us by changing color. So let's walk through the kind of visual guide of what those colors mean and the why behind them. So first off, that yellowing of the outer margins, we think of potash or potassium deficiency. So if you're seeing that yellowing start at the tip of the leaf and kind of move backwards along the outer edges or margins of the lower leaves, that is classic potassium deficiency. So the why behind that, potassium is highly mobile in the plant. So if the roots can't find enough in the soil, that's often because of a restricted root growth or maybe dry soil pockets or, some localized compaction, that plant will rob potassium from the older leaves. And, the lower leaves, they go and they feed that newer upper growth. Secondly, that if we see that yellow inverted V, we're thinking nitrogen deficiency. So if you see the yellowing that starts at the leaf tip but runs straight down the center midrib of that leaf, and you get that shape of an inverted V on the lower leaves of the corn, that's the nitrogen deficiency. The why here is kind of just like potassium, nitrogen is also mobile. That plant activity cannibalizes its lower leaves to keep the upper canopy green and growing. So if you see this climbing up past those lower couple of leaves, your crop is probably running out of gas. So the third one for colors here is that interveinal chlorosis, or kind of that yellow striping in the leaves. Now this is where the leaf margins, or rather the leaf itself remains green along the veins, but the tissue between the veins turns yellow or kind of pale. And that creates that striping appearance. So depending on your soil, this could mean a few different things. One case we think about sulfur deficiency, and this usually shows up as kind of a general interveinal chlorosis. But unlike nitrogen, sulfur is immobile in the plant. So because the plant can't move the sulfur from the old leaves to the new leaves, these striping symptoms show up on the younger and upper leaves first. The second thing we think about with this striping is possibly a manganese deficiency. And so if you're farming on some higher pH soils, that striping can indicate a manganese deficiency. That high pH, it just locks up the manganese, making it unavailable to the plant. The third thing on striping I think about is magnesium deficiency. And that's, if you're on lower pH, more acidic or sandy soils, Now, that striping on the lower leaves often does point to magnesium deficiency. So, of course, the million-dollar question is, what can we do about it if we're seeing these deficiencies today? Now, though we never want to turn our back on a growing crop, the honest answer is that we just have to weigh the cost of the product and application against the potential return on investment. So, for micronutrients such as sulfur, manganese, and magnesium, and for potassium, a foliar application at this VT time, it's just, whether that's via an airplane or, even some high clearance rigs, it's often more of a feel-good pass than probably a high return on investment decision. The reality is that foliar applications can only deliver smaller amounts of nutrients at a time like this without burning the tissue at VT. So the vast majority of your yield potential has already kind of been determined there. Now, the real value of seeing these symptoms today is probably more diagnostic. First off, I would dig some roots and see if there is an issue due to either sidewall or zone compaction, and then maybe take a tissue sample and a soil sample from the affected areas. Compare it to the healthy areas of the field, and then use that data to adjust your dry fertilizer and starter programs for next spring. Now, for nitrogen, that is the exception. If you have severe nitrogen deficiency, perhaps due to the denitrification we talked about earlier, and you have the ability to apply late nitrogen, it can absolutely pay. Now, corn takes up a massive amount of its total nitrogen after tasseling and during that grain fill period. So, if you do have a high clearance rig with wide drops or the ability to maybe fly on some urea, a late season rescue application of nitrogen can protect your kernel depth and your test weight, saving your yield potential from potentially a significant drop. So, to wrap up this week's episode, here's your 3 takeaways. Now, first of all, let's watch the soil moisture, but appreciate the lower humidity, because saturated soils and warm temperatures drive denitrification. But lower humidity helps the crop and the air both pump the water out fast, trying to get that oxygen back to the roots. Secondly, use the leaves as your diagnostic blueprint. Yellow margins mean potassium. A yellow inverted V means nitrogen deficiency. And that striping can mean sulfur, manganese, or magnesium, depending on your soil pH. And then thirdly, be realistic with late season fixes. While nitrogen can be successfully rescued late with Y drops, most other nutrient deficiencies showing up at VT are more lessons for next year's crop plan rather than a profitable quick fix today. So, I want to thank you again for tuning into this week's Agronomy in Action podcast. Stay patient, stay safe, and I'll see you in the field.